The autumn morning brought a gentle breeze to downtown Atlanta as Judge Evelyn Marshall's black Mercedes pulled into her reserved parking spot at the courthouse. The digital clock on her dashboard showed 7:45 a.m., exactly 45 minutes before her first case. Being early was a habit she had developed over her 15 years on the bench, a practice that had served her well. At 52 years old, Judge Marshall carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from decades of breaking barriers. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her black judge's robe was draped carefully over her arm as she walked through the courthouse's employee entrance. The security guards greeted her with warm smiles and respectful nods. "Good morning, Your Honor," said Tom, the elderly security guard who had been working at the courthouse since before she became a judge. "Beautiful day ahead." "Indeed it is, Tom," she replied with a warm smile. "How's that granddaughter of yours doing in college?" Tom's face lit up. "Dean's List again, Judge. She's making us all proud." This was Judge Marshall's way. She remembered the small details about people's lives, believed in building bridges wherever she went. It was something her father, a civil rights attorney in the 1960s, had taught her. Respect is earned not just through your work, but through how you treat every single person you meet. As she entered her chambers, her clerk, Michael Chen, was already waiting with a stack of files and a cup of her favorite green tea. The steam rose from the cup, carrying the supple scent of jasmine through the room. "Good morning, Your Honor," Michael said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "We have a full docket today. 12 cases, including 3 traffic violations, 2 property disputes, and a civil suit." He paused, shuffling through his papers with slight hesitation. Judge Marshall noticed his unease as she hung up her robe. "Something on your mind, Michael?" "Well, yes," he replied, pulling out a specific file. "There's this traffic violation case that might need your special attention. Officer James Reynolds is the arresting officer, and there have been some concerns." She raised an eyebrow, taking the file from Michael. "What kind of concerns?" "There have been 3 complaints filed against him in the past month regarding his conduct during traffic stops, particularly with minority drivers. Nothing serious enough to stick, but," Michael trailed off. Judge Marshall nodded slowly, opening the file. She had seen cases like this before. Officers who carried their prejudices like a badge, hidden behind a uniform and authority. But she had also seen many good officers, men and women who served their community with honor and respect. "Thank you, Michael. I'll review this carefully," she said, settling into her leather chair. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow on the various diplomas and certificates hanging on her wall. Harvard Law, her bar admission, her judicial appointment. Each one represented years of hard work, approving herself in a system that hadn't always welcomed her presence. She spent the next 30 minutes reviewing the cases for the day, paying special attention to Officer Reynolds' file. The traffic stop in question involved a young black college student who had allegedly run a stop sign. The student claimed he had come to a complete stop, and that the officer had been unnecessarily aggressive during their interaction. As she read, Judge Marshall thought about her own son, now a successful architect in Chicago. How many times had she worried about him during traffic stops? How many conversations had they had about keeping calm, about surviving encounters that should have been routine? At 8:25 a.m., she stood up and put on her robe, straightening it in the full-length mirror near her door. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Stand tall, speak clear, and never let them see you sweat." She had lived by those words throughout her career, through law school, through her time as a prosecutor, and now as a judge. Michael appeared at her door. "They're ready for you, Your Honor." Judge Marshall gathered her files and took one last sip of tea. As she walked toward her courtroom, her heels clicking against the marble floor, she carried with her not just the weight of the law, but the responsibility of administering it with wisdom, fairness, and when necessary, instructive firmness. Little did she know that this ordinary Thursday would soon become anything but routine, as she was about to face one of the most challenging tests of her judicial career. The morning session moved swiftly as Judge Marshall handled several routine cases. By 10:30 a.m., the courtroom was filled with the usual mix of lawyers, defendants, and observers. The air conditioning hummed quietly, barely masking the whispered conversations and shuffling papers. Officer James Reynolds strode into the courtroom for his 10:45 a.m. traffic violation case, At 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and 12 years on the force, he carried himself with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. His police uniform was perfectly pressed, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He took his place at the front of the courtroom, standing with his hands clasped behind his back. Case number 2024 TR 789, announced the court clerk. Traffic violation. Failure to stop at a stop sign. Officer James Reynolds versus Marcus Thompson. Marcus Thompson, a 20-year-old college student wearing a neat blue suit that still had the rental tags hidden underneath, sat nervously at the defendant's table. His mother, a high school teacher, sat right behind him in the gallery, clutching her purse tightly. Judge Marshall looked at the papers before her. Officer Reynolds, please present your account of the events that occurred on the evening of March 15th. Officer Reynolds shifted his weight and spoke loudly, his voice carrying across the courtroom. Yes, ma'am. He emphasized the word ma'am in a way that made several heads turn. It wasn't the respectful Your Honor that was customary in court proceedings. On the night in question, I observed the defendant's vehicle approaching the intersection of Oak and Pine Street. The vehicle rolled through the stop sign without coming to a complete stop. His tone was clipped and dismissive. Judge Marshall's expression remained neutral. Officer Reynolds, in this courtroom, the proper form of address is Your Honor. Reynolds's jaw tightened slightly. Right, ma'am. I mean, whatever you prefer. A few gasps could be heard from the gallery. The court reporter's fingers paused briefly over her keyboard. Officer, Judge Marshall's voice remained steady. I'm not expressing a preference. I'm stating the proper protocol for this courtroom. Please continue your testimony, addressing the court appropriately. Reynolds's face flushed red. Look, ma'am, I've been doing this job for 12 years. I know what I saw that night. The boy, he gestured dismissively toward Marcus, ran the stop sign. Simple as that. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop several degrees. Michael Chen, the clerk, straightened in his chair, his eyes widening. The court bailiff took a small step forward. Judge Marshall placed her pen down carefully. Officer Reynolds approached the bench. As Reynolds walked forward, his boots echoing on the floor, Judge Marshall noticed his hand resting on his utility belt, a subtle but clear display of his authority. He stopped in front of her bench, standing at his full height. Officer, she spoke quietly but firmly, your years of service are commendable, but they do not exempt you from showing proper respect to this court. Your current behavior suggests either a lack of training in courtroom procedure or a deliberate choice to disregard it. Which is it? Reynolds's nostrils flared slightly. With all due respect, ma'am, I think we're getting off track here. We're supposed to be talking about the traffic violation, not about how I address you. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even the usual shuffling of papers had stopped. Marcus Thompson and his mother exchanged worried glances, while the other officers present in the courtroom for different cases looked uncomfortable. Judge Marshall's dark eyes met Reynolds's challenging stare. Her decades of experience had taught her to recognize the subtle signs of prejudice, the slightly turned shoulder, the deliberate misuse of titles, the tone that suggested speaking to an equal rather than a judicial authority. She glanced at the clock, 11:05 a.m. What had started as a simple traffic violation hearing was clearly becoming something much more significant. The next few moments would require all of her experience, wisdom, and restraint. Officer Reynolds, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, before we proceed with your testimony, I believe we need to address the matter of contempt. Would you like to reconsider your approach to these proceedings? The tension in the courtroom stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight, ready to snap at any moment. The next few words from Officer Reynolds would determine much more than just the outcome of a simple traffic case. Officer Reynolds shifted his weight, his polished black boots squeaking against the courtroom floor. The challenge in his eyes hadn't dimmed. If anything, it had grown stronger. Look, he said, his voice carrying across the now silent courtroom, maybe things were different back in your day, but I've been trained by the best. I know police procedure like the back of my hand. When I see a violation, I call it. Judge Marshall's face remained composed, though her fingers pressed slightly harder against her wooden desk. 20 pairs of eyes darted between her and the officer, like spectators at a tennis match. Officer Reynolds, she said calmly, your expertise in police procedure isn't in question here. What concerns this court is your persistent disregard for basic courtroom protocol. Reynolds let out a short laugh that echoed off the high ceiling. Protocol? I'm here to present evidence about a traffic violation. All this fuss about titles seems like a waste of taxpayer money to me. In the gallery, Marcus Thompson's mother reached forward and squeezed her son's shoulder. Other officers present in the courtroom began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. One of them, Sergeant Davis, a veteran officer with gray hair and 30 years of experience, shook his head slowly. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, recording every word of the increasingly tense exchange. Michael Chen, the clerk, had stopped shuffling papers and sat perfectly still, his eyes wide behind his glasses. Judge Marshall leaned forward slightly. Officer Reynolds, let me be clear. Your current behavior suggests a troubling pattern. Since entering this courtroom, you have 1. Repeatedly refused to use proper judicial address. 2. Displayed dismissive body language. 3. Interrupted court proceedings. 4. And now, you're questioning the very foundations of courtroom decorum. Reynolds crossed his arms over his chest, his badge catching the fluorescent light. Maybe if we spend less time worrying about fancy titles and more time dealing with actual crime. Officer, Judge Marshall cut in, her voice sharp but controlled. Are you suggesting that maintaining proper court procedure is somehow less important than other aspects of law enforcement? I'm suggesting, Reynolds said, his voice rising slightly, that some people get too caught up in their positions. Just because someone puts on a black robe doesn't mean they understand what it's like out there on the streets. A collective gasp rose from the gallery. Even Marcus Thompson, despite being the subject of Reynolds' original complaint, looked shocked at the officer's behavior. Judge Marshall slowly removed her reading glasses, placing them carefully on the bench before her. The simple action somehow commanded more attention than any raised voice could have. Officer Reynolds, she began, her voice carrying the weight of her 15 years on the bench, you seem to be laboring under several misconceptions. First, that courtroom protocol is merely about fancy titles. Second, that your experience somehow exempts you from showing basic respect to this court. And third, she paused, looking directly into his eyes, that I don't understand the streets. She stood up, her black robe falling in perfect folds around her. Before I took this position, I spent 5 years as a public defender in downtown Atlanta. I walked those same streets you patrol. I defended both the innocent and the guilty. I saw firsthand the challenges faced by law enforcement and citizens alike. Reynolds' face reddened, but he maintained his defiant stance. With all due respect, ma'am, he emphasized the word again. Reading about crime in case files isn't the same as dealing with it face to face. The bailiff took another step forward, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Judge Marshall raised her hand slightly, signaling the bailiff to stay where he was. Her voice, when she spoke again, was quiet but carried to every corner of the hushed courtroom. Officer Reynolds, would you like to rephrase your last statement? Consider your response carefully, as it will determine whether we proceed with a simple contempt citation or explore more serious consequences for your conduct. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed. The next few moments would either diffuse the situation or escalate it to a point of no return. Reynolds stood at the crossroads, his next words poised to either salvage his professional reputation or damage it irreparably. Officer Reynolds' face hardened as he stared up at Judge Marshall. The moment stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight, ready to snap at any second. The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting for his response. Maybe, Reynolds said, his voice dripping with barely contained anger, we need someone more qualified to handle this case. Someone who understands the real challenges of law enforcement. Someone with more, he paused deliberately, experience. The words hung in the air like smoke. Several people in the gallery audibly gasped. Michael Chen, the clerk, dropped his pen, the small clatter echoing through the stunned silence. Marcus Thompson and his mother exchanged wide-eyed looks of disbelief. Sergeant Davis, who had been watching from the gallery, stood up abruptly. Officer Reynolds, he barked, stand down. But Reynolds wasn't finished. He took a step closer to the bench, his body language aggressive. I've watched too many good officers get undermined by people who've never worn a badge. People who sit in their comfortable chairs, making decisions about things they don't understand. Judge Marshall remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. Only those who knew her well might have noticed the slight tightening around her eyes, the barely perceptible straightening of her spine. "Your Honor," the court bailiff called out, moving forward with purpose, "would you like me to remove Officer Reynolds from the courtroom?" Reynolds turned his head sharply toward the bailiff. "I'm not finished presenting my evidence. The defendant clearly violated traffic laws, and I'm not leaving until—" "Officer Reynolds," Judge Marshall's voice cut through the tension like a steel blade through butter. "You are finished. Not just for today, but possibly for much longer than that." She pressed the intercom button on her desk. "Please call Chief Williams to my courtroom immediately." Her voice was steady, controlled, but carried an authority that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Reynolds's face paled slightly at the mention of the police chief, but he stood his ground. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. One little disagreement about proper address, and suddenly—" "This is not about proper address anymore, Officer Reynolds," Judge Marshall interrupted, her words precise and measured. "This is about fundamental respect for the law itself, the very law you swore to uphold." The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Chief Williams, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and dark skin, entered quickly. His face was grim as he took in the scene before him. "Chief Williams," Judge Marshall said, "I believe we need to have a serious discussion about one of your officers." Reynolds turned to face his superior, his shoulders tensing. "Chief, this is a misunderstanding. I was simply trying to present evidence in a traffic violation case, and—" Silence. Chief Williams's command echoed through the courtroom. "I heard enough from outside the courtroom door. Your behavior is inexcusable." Judge Marshall raised her hand slightly. "If I may, Chief Williams, before we proceed further." She turned her attention back to Reynolds, who now stood caught between his defiance and the growing realization of his situation. "Officer Reynolds," she began, her voice carrying not anger but something more powerful, disappointment mixed with resolve. "In my 15 years on this bench, I have seen thousands of officers present evidence. Many of them disagreed with my rulings. Some even appealed them. But none, not one, has ever shown such blatant disrespect for this court and its proceedings." She paused, looking around the courtroom. The morning sun streaming through the high windows cast long shadows across the floor, marking the passage of time in this pivotal moment. "What you have displayed today is not just contempt for me as a judge, but contempt for the very system of justice you claim to serve. Your words and actions suggest prejudices that have no place in law enforcement or in this courtroom." The clock on the wall showed 11:45 a.m. What had started as a routine traffic violation hearing had transformed into a moment that would likely reshape careers and challenge deep-seated attitudes. Judge Marshall straightened her robe, preparing to deliver a response that would resonate far beyond the walls of her courtroom. Judge Marshall stood at her full height behind the bench, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the courtroom. The tension that had been building all morning was about to reach its peak. "Officer Reynolds," she began, removing her reading glasses slowly and placing them on the polished wooden surface before her. "Before I address your conduct, let me tell you a story that you seem to need to hear." The officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the judge and Chief Williams, who now stood with his arms crossed, watching intently. 30 years ago," Judge Marshall continued, her voice clear and steady, "I walked into this very courthouse for the first time. Not as a judge, but as a young lawyer fresh out of Harvard Law School. A security guard stopped me at the door, assuming I was in the wrong building. He couldn't believe I was an attorney." She paused, letting her words sink in. The entire courtroom remained silent, hanging on every word. 10 years later, when I became the first black female prosecutor in this district, a police officer much like yourself refused to share case details with me. He, too, questioned my qualifications. Her dark eyes fixed on Reynolds. "Would you like to know what happened to that officer?" Reynolds swallowed hard but remained silent. He later apologized, not because he had to, but because he realized his prejudice had nearly cost him a conviction in a major case. "We went on to work together for 5 years, solving some of the most challenging cases this district has seen." Judge Marshall stepped down from her bench, something she rarely did. Her heels clicked against the floor as she approached the front of her bench, standing just a few feet from Reynolds. In my career, I have prosecuted drug lords who threatened my life. I have protected witnesses who risked everything for justice. I have sentenced murderers and exonerated the innocent. I have seen the darkness in our streets that you speak of, Officer Reynolds, not from behind a desk, but from the trenches. She gestured to the walls around them, where photographs of previous judges hung. When I took this position, I became only the third black judge in this courthouse's history, and the first black woman. Each day, I carry that responsibility along with the duty to uphold the law, the same law you swore to protect. Marcus Thompson and his mother watched with wide eyes, the traffic violation case momentarily forgotten in the gravity of the moment. Michael Chen, the clerk, had stopped typing, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as he listened. You spoke of qualifications, Judge Marshall continued, her voice gaining strength. Let me share mine. Top of my class at Harvard Law, 15 years as a prosecutor with a 94% conviction rate, author of 3 books on criminal justice reform, and mentor to dozens of young lawyers who now serve across this country. She turned slightly, addressing not just Reynolds but the entire courtroom. But my most important qualification isn't on any resume or certificate. It's the understanding that justice requires respect. Respect for the law, respect for the court, and respect for every person who walks through those doors, regardless of their race, gender, or position. Chief Williams nodded slowly, pride evident in his expression. Several officers in the gallery sat straighter, some looking ashamed, others appearing moved by her words. Officer Reynolds, she turned back to face him directly. Your conduct today reflects not just on you, but on every officer who wears that badge. Your disrespect dishonors them, this court, and the principles of justice we all serve. She paused, letting the weight of her words fill the room. The morning sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor, marking this moment in time. Now, she said, her voice firm but not unkind, you have a choice to make. Will you be remembered as the officer who let his prejudices destroy his career, or as someone who learned from this moment and became a better servant of the law? The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Officer Reynolds stood frozen, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame. The entire courtroom waited for his response, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after this day was over. The silence in the courtroom felt heavy as Judge Marshall returned to her bench. Officer Reynolds stood rooted to his spot, his face a mix of emotions, shame, confusion, and lingering defiance wrestling across his features. Your Honor, Chief Williams stepped forward, his deep voice carrying authority. With your permission, I'd like to share something with the court. Judge Marshall nodded, gesturing for him to proceed. Chief Williams turned to face the gallery, his 25 years of police leadership evident in his bearing. When I first joined the force in 1999, things were different. We had officers who looked like Officer Reynolds who wouldn't even ride in the same patrol car as officers who looked like me. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his eyes now fixed on the floor. But times changed, the chief continued, not because someone forced them to, but because good people chose to learn and grow. I stand here today as your chief not because the world suddenly became perfect, but because people like Judge Marshall fought to make the justice system fair for everyone. He turned to face Reynolds directly. Son, I've reviewed your record. You're a good officer when it comes to procedure. Your arrest records are clean, your paperwork is always on time. But today, you've shown us all what's in your heart, and that concerns me more than any traffic violation ever could. Marcus Thompson and his mother exchanged glances. What had started as their simple traffic ticket hearing had transformed into something much more significant, a lesson about justice, respect, and change. Judge Marshall leaned forward slightly. Officer Reynolds, do you understand why your conduct today has drawn such attention? Reynolds cleared his throat, his voice noticeably less confident than before. I was focused on doing my job, following procedure. Following procedure? Judge Marshall's voice carried a hint of irony. Let's examine that claim. She picked up a thick law book from her desk. Section 45 of our state judicial code clearly outlines proper courtroom conduct. Would you like me to read it? Before Reynolds could respond, she continued. It states that all officers of the court, including law enforcement officers, shall maintain decorum and show appropriate respect to judicial authorities. This isn't about my personal preferences, Officer Reynolds. This is about the law, the very law you swore to uphold. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting different shadows now. Through the high windows, clouds drifted past, as if nature itself was pausing to witness this moment. Sergeant Davis stood up again from his seat in the gallery. Your Honor, permission to approach? After receiving a nod from Judge Marshall, the veteran officer walked forward. His gray hair and weathered face spoke of decades of experience. I trained Officer Reynolds when he first joined the force, Davis said, his voice carrying disappointment. We spent weeks discussing not just procedures, but the importance of respect. Respect for the law, for the court, for the community. He turned to face his former trainee. What I've seen today isn't what I taught you, son. Reynolds' shoulders slumped slightly. The weight of his actions, amplified by his superior officer's words, seemed to finally break through his defensive shell. Judge Marshall surveyed the courtroom. The morning's events had transformed a routine traffic hearing into a powerful teaching moment about respect, prejudice, and the true meaning of justice. Officer Reynolds, she spoke again, her voice carrying both authority and compassion. This court has two choices. We can treat this as a simple case of contempt, punishable by fines and temporary suspension, or we can use this moment to create real change. She paused, letting her words sink in. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. I'm reminded of a saying my father, who was also a civil rights attorney, often repeated. Justice without compassion is just another form of violence. Today, we have an opportunity to choose justice with compassion. Chief Williams nodded slowly, understanding where the judge was heading. Marcus Thompson and his mother leaned forward, sensing they were about to witness something remarkable. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, ready to record what would come next. Judge Marshall straightened in her chair, preparing to deliver a decision that would reshape not just one officer's career, but potentially the entire department's approach to respect and dignity in the justice system. Judge Marshall's fingers lightly drummed on her desk as she prepared to deliver her decision. The entire courtroom leaned forward, sensing the importance of what was about to happen. Officer James Reynolds, she began, her voice carrying both authority and purpose, this court finds you in contempt. However, the penalty will not be what you might expect. Reynolds tensed, preparing himself for the worst. Chief Williams stood nearby, his expression stern but curious about what the judge had in mind. Instead of a fine or suspension, Judge Marshall continued, I am ordering you to complete the following program. She lifted a paper and began to read. First, you will spend 1 week shadowing Mrs. Gloria Thompson, Marcus's mother, at the high school where she teaches history. She gestured toward Marcus's mother, who sat up straighter in surprise. There, you will observe her advanced placement class on civil rights in America. Reynolds blinked, clearly not expecting this direction. Second, Judge Marshall continued, you will spend the following week working with our court's diversity officer, Mr. James Chen, who happens to be my clerk's father. Mr. Chen has 30 years of experience training law enforcement officers in community relations. Michael Chen smiled slightly from his position at the clerk's desk, now understanding why Judge Marshall had asked about his father's availability earlier that week. Third, you will attend our judicial shadowing program. For 5 full days, you will observe court proceedings from this bench, sitting beside me, seeing what I see, hearing what I hear, and understanding the weight of decisions that affect people's lives. The bailiff raised his eyebrows, impressed by the creative nature of the sentence. This wasn't punishment, it was education. Fourth, she paused for emphasis, you will write a comprehensive report about your experiences and present it to your fellow officers during their monthly training session. Chief Williams, I trust you'll make the necessary arrangements. Yes, Your Honor, the chief replied, nodding approvingly. We'll make it a mandatory session for all officers. Officer Reynolds stood still, processing the unexpected turn of events. His face showed a mix of relief and uncertainty. And finally, Judge Marshall's voice softened slightly. You will return to this courtroom in 1 month to share what you've learned. Not as a defendant, but as an officer of the law who has gained new perspective. She leaned forward, making direct eye contact with Reynolds. Do you understand and accept these terms, officer? Reynolds swallowed hard, his earlier defiance completely gone. Yes, Your Honor, he replied, using the proper address for the first time that day. Very well. Judge Marshall nodded. She turned to address Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson, would you be willing to assist in this educational process? Gloria Thompson stood, smoothing her skirt. It would be my honor, Judge Marshall. My students could benefit from understanding law enforcement's perspective as well. Perhaps Officer Reynolds could share some positive experiences from his career. The tension in the courtroom began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of possibility. Sergeant Davis smiled proudly. This was how real change happened, not through punishment alone, but through understanding. Chief Williams stepped forward. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to expand this program. Perhaps we could make it part of our regular officer training. Judge Marshall smiled for the first time that day. That, Chief Williams, is exactly what I was hoping you'd suggest. Mr. Chen, please make a note to draft a formal proposal for such a program. She then turned back to Officer Reynolds, who stood straighter under her gaze. Officer, your first session begins tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp at Lincoln High School. Mrs. Thompson will expect you in full uniform. Remember, you're not just representing yourself, but your entire department. Reynolds nodded, a new understanding beginning to show in his eyes. Yes, Your Honor, I understand. Good, Judge Marshall replied. She picked up her gavel, ready to make it official. This court's decision is final. We will reconvene in 1 month to assess the progress. The gavel struck with a decisive crack. As the courtroom began to stir, conversations breaking out in hushed tones, Judge Marshall watched Officer Reynolds shake hands with Mrs. Thompson, their interaction awkward but civil. Sometimes, she thought, the best way to break down walls was to build bridges instead. 1 month later, the same courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Every seat was filled, with additional chairs brought in to accommodate the unusual crowd. Police officers in uniform lined the back wall, and Mrs. Thompson's entire AP history class sat in the front rows, notebooks ready. At exactly 10 o'clock a.m., Judge Marshall entered the courtroom. All rise, called the bailiff, his voice carrying across the packed room. Officer James Reynolds stood at attention in his crisp uniform, looking noticeably different from the man who had shown such disrespect 4 weeks earlier. His posture was straight, but his eyes held humility that hadn't been there before. Officer Reynolds, Judge Marshall began, settling into her chair. You stand before this court to share what you've learned from your assigned program. Please proceed. Reynolds stepped forward, cleared his throat, and faced the crowd. Your Honor, Chief Williams, fellow officers and students, he began, his voice steady but humble. The past month has changed my life in ways I never expected. He pulled out a small notebook, though it was clear he knew his words by heart. In Mrs. Thompson's classroom, I learned about Ruby Bridges, who faced angry crowds just to go to school. I watched as students debated civil rights cases with more understanding than I had after 12 years on the force. Mrs. Thompson smiled encouragingly from her seat, remembering how her students had initially been wary of the officer, but gradually opened up to him during discussions. Working with Mr. Chen showed me blind spots I didn't know I had, Reynolds continued. He taught me that respect isn't just about following rules, it's about recognizing the dignity in every person we serve. Michael Chen, still at his clerk's desk, nodded approvingly as he thought about his father's reports of Reynolds' progress. But the most profound experience, Reynolds paused, taking a deep breath, was sitting beside Your Honor on the bench. I saw how each decision affects real lives. I watched as you balanced justice with mercy, law with understanding. Judge Marshall listened intently, her expression neutral but her eyes attentive. I came into this courtroom a month ago thinking I knew everything about law enforcement. I was wrong. Reynolds turned to face his fellow officers. We're not just badge numbers and protocols. We're part of a bigger system of justice that only works when everyone is treated with respect. Chief Williams, standing near the door, smiled proudly. The program had exceeded his expectations, and plans were already in place to make it a permanent part of officer training. Yesterday, Reynolds continued, I pulled over a young black man for speeding. Instead of approaching with assumptions, I remembered what I learned. We had a respectful conversation. He got his ticket, but he also got my card and an invitation to join our community outreach program. Several officers nodded in approval. The change in their colleague was evident to everyone. Your Honor, Reynolds turned back to Judge Marshall. I want to apologize again for my behavior that day. I dishonored this court, my badge, and myself. But thanks to your wisdom in choosing education over punishment, I stand here a better officer and a better person. Judge Marshall finally allowed herself a small smile. Officer Reynolds, do you understand now why proper courtroom protocol exists? Yes, Your Honor, he replied without hesitation. It's not about titles or power. It's about respecting the system of justice we all serve. Very well, Judge Marshall said, rising from her seat. This court is pleased to note your successful completion of the program. She looked around the packed courtroom. Let this be a reminder that justice works best when we understand each other's perspectives. She turned to Mrs. Thompson's students. Young people, you've witnessed how our legal system can transform conflict into understanding. Remember this day. The students nodded eagerly, several making quick notes in their notebooks. Officer Reynolds, Judge Marshall concluded, you entered this courtroom a month ago facing contempt charges. You leave it today as an example of how positive change happens. Court dismissed. The gavel struck with finality, but nobody rushed to leave. Instead, people mingled. Officers chatting with students, Mrs. Thompson discussing future collaboration with the police department, and Chief Williams making plans with Mr. Chen for expanding the training program. As Judge Marshall gathered her papers, she watched Officer Reynolds shaking hands with Marcus Thompson and his mother. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest victories in justice came not from punishments handed down, but from minds and hearts opened up. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, lighting up the courtroom with promise of a new day and a better way forward.